say that, why did the Cherokee Nation get kicked off their land?
Okay, so the big problem with Indian tribes is that they're normally not united against Europeans, the British and later the United States, and this is what brings about their downfall. So the Cherokee, right, they were a sovereign nation. They had their own constitution, and it was recognized by the United States, and their borders were understood to be accepted by the United States. But Andrew Jackson comes along. Now, Andrew Jackson had long talked about Indian removal, right? He made no bones about it, and when he got into the White House, this is what he was going to push through Congress, and he did. But, he had been pushing for this for, years and years and years. And
Wait, why was he pushing it? Do you know?
because he was other things, because he's Andrew Jackson. I mean, Andrew Jackson, despite the Trail of Tears and all that, you can make a strong argument that he didn't hate the tribes. He just wanted them out of the way.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
And he's like, basically the whole thing is, the Trail of Tears it's called that because in 1838, the Cherokee ultimately, are finally removed by the U.S. military, by the Army in particular, and they're sent westward across the Mississippi. The problem is they, believe that the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court had voted in favor of them in Worcester versus Georgia, and
in favor of them, in favor of the Cherokee.
Yeah, in favor of the Cherokee. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself.
Okay, I was gonna say what?
Cherokee Nation is a sovereign nation.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And they're heavily Christianized and they're heavily Americanized, right? Because they live in close contact with the Americans, and the Cherokee believe, okay, if we take on American ways while still maintaining our traditional values and culture, we can live peaceably and coexist together, right? Mm-hmm. That's the theory.
Yeah.
And the Cherokee were counted amongst the 5 civilized tribes, right? They were called that because they took on, Christian ways, and they allowed missionaries, and there was a lot of intermarriage between Cherokee and, Americans and whatnot. So you're getting interracial children and stuff like that. But there are many, of course, who see them, they're Cherokee and we want them gone, and we'll send them, west of the Mississippi, and we'll give them land there and they will be out of the way and blah, 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 blah. So Georgia, the state of Georgia, says in the late 1820s, early 1830s, that all Cherokee lands within Georgia, what the Georgians consider to be Georgia, is part of Georgia. Georgia doesn't recognize Cherokee sovereignty. So one way they go about this is that if you were a Christian missionary, and missionaries had been living amongst the Cherokee for decades before this, you could not enter into Cherokee territory or live amongst them without a permit granted by the state of Georgia. And one way to do this, right, was to deprive the Cherokee of their loudest supporters within American society, these missionaries. And one of them.
So you have that they don't recognize the land as being Cherokee land, yes. But you can't go in and into that land, which is Georgia land, and be missionaries. Yeah, without a permit. That makes no sense.
Because the Georgians are like, this is our land, and if you want to, their legislature enacted it. It's in the unit.
Yeah.
Buy it, $5.
Yeah.
$5, people. Anyway, so Worcester gets arrested by Georgian authorities, and the Cherokee are like, this is interfering with our sovereignty. So they take it all the way up to the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court hears it in a case called Worcester versus Georgia. And the Supreme Court says, Georgia, you're in the wrong. You must release this man, Cherokee. They're their own nation, their own sovereignty, their own borders. You have no right to their land whatsoever. This is a monumental decision, right?
Yeah.
Considering that, many people simply look upon the United States as, just going in to exterminate these people. No. I mean, there was plenty of that, true, but there was plenty of fighting for indigenous rights. And, Worcester versus Georgia is a perfect example of this. But in one of the grossest breaches of checks and balances, Andrew Jackson says very famously of Chief Justice John Marshall, Justice Marshall has spoken, now let him enforce his will, right? But he couldn't do that because, he's just judiciary, right?
Yeah.
He has no authority beyond interpretation of the law. So Andrew Jackson gets the Georgians are starting to put more and more and more pressure on the Cherokee. And certain leaders amongst the Cherokee begin to realize, okay, we're not going to win this fight, so we might as well just sign away our land and move away, peacefully. And this is called the treaty part, right? And amongst these, the people who signed this, you have men like Major Ridge, who was, a very proud Cherokee who had fought the United States in his younger days, his son, and a couple of others. But they didn't have the authority to do so because none of them were the principal chief. And the principal chief is like, the chief executive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nor did they have the permission of the, Supreme Council, like that, which is essentially their legislature.
Yeah.
And these handful of Cherokee leaders, without the backing of the majority of the Cherokee people, signed a treaty called the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, ceding all Cherokee land east of the Mississippi to the United States.
But they couldn't exactly do that. There wasn't their right?
Yeah. They had no authority nor power to do so. But the United States sees this as a legally binding treaty, okay? The majority of the Cherokee, however, are like, hey, they had no right to do that, so we're just going to ignore that. All right, and Jackson and Van Buren, who came after him, President Van Buren, they give the Cherokee 2 years to up and move. All right, and then finally in May 1838, when they hadn't moved, they send in the army led by General Winfield Scott, and they surround the place and they round people up and they put them into stockades, right, preparatory to advancing westward. But, it's summer and there's no food really, and so a lot of people die of disease and starvation in these stockades until finally in the fall of 1838, they finally begin to move westward. The problem is the winter of 1838, 1839 is the coldest in living memory, right? And these people are marching from Georgia through Tennessee and Kentucky and, and that's just nasty terrain, to march through on foot to get all the way to the Mississippi. And how many rivers they have to cross? Well, a lot of these rivers end up freezing, right? Or, swelling due to rain. So making them impassable. So you only have enough rations for a certain amount of time. And if a river is impassable, you can't get across. You're basically stuck there in the wind and the rain and the cold and, what's going to happen. You're going to freeze to death. The infants are going to die. The old are going to die. And so something like eventually 4,000 or so Cherokee out of the 15,000 that make this march end up dying. And, 4,000 out of 15,000, that's substantial, personally. And in Cherokee, that's where Trail of Tears comes from. Specific Cherokee word that I would butcher, so I'm not going to repeat it at the moment, but it's in the unit. So that's the Trail of Tears, essentially.
So here's an interesting thing. This is one of the reasons why I am so connected or interested in the Trail of Tears. So I'm related to Andrew Jackson.
Really?
I'm also related to I'm a Cherokee.
Really?
Yeah. So during the Trail of Tears, my grandmother, one of my grandmothers, was actually uh, she was an infant, and she
Yeah.
was passed over to a white family. And it could have been that they had it was like um, a husband and wife that actually intermarried. I don't know, but the infant was given to a white family. So we have her number, but we've never been able to basically prove that um, who she is because we just have no records of her.
Yeah.
Minus her number. And then come to find out a few years ago, I actually had a second grandmother or great, 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 whatever grandmother, who actually, I think she made it through the Trail of Tears and made it out
Wow.
to the land. And then she had married. And so it's just interesting that I have Andrew Jackson who
That's
kicked out
fascinating.
yeah, and that, so it's like, well, okay, so yesterday it was really funny. I actually did I went back in my family tree, and it's this big Ancestry.com uh, family tree that they put together. I went back all the way to the Romans, so I'm related to
How'd you get
Caesar.
all the way back to the Romans?
I went back to 259 BC.
How'd you do that?
Ancestry.com. Yeah. So basically, if you know your parents' genealogy,
Yeah.
you go back far enough that other people have already done the genealogy of other things, and so it just basically connects, and then you can go back as far as somebody's done the work.
Holy mackerel.
Yeah. So I was looking through all the Romans that I'm related to, and then the Greeks that they came from, and all these other things, and I was just like, whoa. So it's really interesting. I'm also related to Charlemagne, King Henry VIII, which is not something to be too proud of, but and then like all these kings and such. And I think the reason why I know about all the kings or that's the genealogy's done is because those are the people that the genealogy was actually kept for. The regular peasants weren't even kept, so
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
You wouldn't even know that part, that section.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dude, that's freaking cool.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
I thought that was really cool. But yeah, Andrew Jackson and Cherokees. So Andrew Jackson, if he ever looks back, he can see that he's like, oh crud, I was really stupid. So
yeah, I mean, uh,
well, at the same time, I didn't even know about the treaty that was written.
Oh yeah,
So
New Ecota. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. The Cherokee or certain among them sold the nation out, and but this is a common theme in tribal relations with the United States because you know it tends to be that when they go to war, okay, the Indians will win early on, right? They'll have the momentum, they will succeed on the battlefield, but
more passion.
after that, what?
More passion.
Yeah, more passion, definitely. But after these initial successes, they begin to slow down. They lose momentum. They don't have the resources to sustain operations. And when casualties begin to mount, there's only so many of them. Whereas the United States, for example, which has a standing professional army, right, well led most of the time, or on occasion, supplied. It has a logistical infrastructure to sustain operations, not indefinitely, but for far greater periods of time than what the natives can bring together. Also, the United States, as did the British and the French before them, they made brilliant use of native allies, right? So, for example, Geronimo, right, the great Apache leader, he is finally captured, by an expedition which is not headed by, but features large numbers of highly skilled Apache scouts, right?
Yeah.
Sitting Bull, the great Lakota war, the great Lakota chief, he is killed on the Pine Ridge Reservation by Lakota police, right, in American uniform. Mm-hmm. So, Sitting Bull is killed by his own people. That's striking. That's absolutely striking. Well, but when you look at the number of tribes that willingly fight with the United States, for example, the Crow and the Pawnee and the Brule and others, you have to wonder, why are they doing this? Well, the Crow, they hate the Sioux or the Lakota before them, because the Sioux, that's our word for them. What were they? They were great conquerors. They were masters of the plain. When Sitting Bull was young, it was said they could field 10,000 warriors. I mean, they were a great power in their day, right? So no wonder certain tribes don't like them. But so with the Cherokee, so about 50 years before the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee sign away most of their lands in Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, and basically all of Kentucky in a treaty called the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals. And the Cherokee chieftains, they did this for the most part willingly, right? They exchanged about several million acres in exchange for, pound sterling, and, alcohol and stuff like that. And there was one young warrior among them whose name was Dragging Canoe, who would dedicate his life to fighting against them. Mm-hmm. And Dragging Canoe is going to take a handful of his supporters, and he's going to create what is essentially a breakaway Cherokee state in what is now Alabama and Georgia, called the Chickamauga Cherokee, essentially. And he will fight the United States, for a further 20 years until he finally dies. But, you're going to see this all the time, right? There's really, even within nations, you have unity is fragile, right? You look at Tecumseh, right? The great Shawnee leader. He has a vision of a pan-Indian buffer zone, which will halt American expansion once and for all. And, he travels all over the Great Lakes, and he travels south. He comes to the Choctaw, right, trying to get them to enter into his alliance. And one of their war chiefs, his name was Pushmatahata, right, who would end up fighting alongside Andrew Jackson in the Creek War. Tecumseh says, we need to fight against the Americans, but Pushmatahata, echoing many others' viewpoints, says, no, we should fight with the United States rather. Mm-hmm. So you have division amongst the tribes themselves and within the tribes themselves. And this is a huge reason why, the United States ultimately reaches the Pacific. Because, the idea that the Indian tribes didn't have a hand in their own fate is ridiculous. The idea that they were merely passive victims is ridiculous. They fought, and they fought well a lot of the time, but, in the end, they were ultimately reduced. Disease had a big role, but, numbers, will, for sure. I mean, many times you have old warriors who have gone through the ringer mm-hmm. before, and they're like, we know what we're talking about. We have fought them before. And then you have, aggressive, spirited younger warriors who are like, we can do whatever the hell we want to and triumph. So this is a dividing line, and in the end,
So let me confirm something. So the Cherokee Nation was actually larger than just Georgia. What states did they cover?
At one point in the mid-18th century, there were about 20,000 Cherokee, mm-hmm. about 20,000, which is substantial. And they could field around about 6,000 warriors, right? Now, that is enormous, because none of their neighbors could get anywhere near that, and that's why they were a powerhouse in their day. But the Cherokee territory it stretched from the Ohio River, so, northern Kentucky, down into northern Alabama and Georgia, westward towards, middle Tennessee, and then eastward into south and, western South and North Carolina and parts of Virginia. So yeah, they were all over the place.
They were. Now, was it
into 4 separate regions made up of a series of towns?
Yeah. So my next question is, were they actually all connected, the land, or did they basically have towns here, and just like separate places, or was it this is our land from this area to this area?
They considered it for sure to be, Cherokee naturally looked upon it as their land, yes, but they were separated by geography. It's like it's like I don't know, look at the United States, right? You have Irish Americans, African Americans, Chinese Americans, etc. So we're all Americans, but geographically we're kind of different. Maybe that's a poor analogy because, yeah, we're culturally separate via our ancestry, but unite. Cherokee weren't culturally separate, right? They were far more homogenous, but they were separated by geography and things like that. But they had capital cities, right, where they, where various people would come together for ceremonies and trade and things like that. So they were definitely all connected, just spread apart,
Yeah, because of geography. So, gotcha.
Like that. But by the time we get to the Trail of Tears, their land is a lot smaller, and there's only about 15,000 of them. But remember, this is the 1830s. They're a far cry from their glory days of a century earlier.
So when they signed over the land in Tennessee and in that area, minus Georgia, where did they go? Did they?
Well, certain amongst the Cherokee stayed there and lived amongst the new incoming settlers. Many of them, because remember, the 1770s, the Cherokee had earlier gotten out of a war with the British, right? Because in the 7 Years' War, they fought with the British. But immediately after, tensions between the two sides spilled over into conflict. And the Cherokee, the British moved in and they burned, hundreds and hundreds of these towns and villages. So you see a sort of contraction within Cherokee territory in the sense that they're basically pushed largely out of South Carolina and Virginia and parts of North Carolina. And they sell off their land in, Tennessee and Kentucky. So some stay there and live, amongst the new settlers. Many others move south, fleeing war and things like that. But a lot of them were killed, remember, disease and war. So, refugees, they're getting more compacted and they're moving all over the place, things like that. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. That's a lot of information. Thank you for sharing that. And where can you find that information?
About World War I today.
I know. Well, we'll keep that for next week.
Okay. Cool.
So where's that information found?
All of it?
Yeah. Where can people find it?
Oh, in the unit.
In the unit on the new website. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it will hopefully be available. We'll say in December.
Brought to you by the hard work of Connor and Zach.
Mostly Connor. Well, and others that are smaller.
It had nothing to do with the Cherokee.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Nothing to do with the Cherokee.
If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.